So as the title of this video suggests, for this project, I'll be making a round carbide lathe tool. So I went to an unnamed local box store and picked up 3/8 square steel rod. I think it cost around $7 total. I brought it home and cut it to length on my hand bandsaw. Not sure how long it was, it just felt like a comfortable length in my hand. I then marked a center point on the steel using my caliper to find the middle. I then used the bit that came bundled with the 440 tap-in drill set I also bought at the box store. Don't worry, if you didn't catch all that, I'll cover it later on in the video. So I made sure I was all lined up, added a little oil, and started drilling. Once that was done, I headed over to my belt grinder and rounded the end of the rod. I did this because, well, it looks really nice. See? What did I tell you? At this point, the carbide tip doesn't sit quite flush on the steel. So I went back to the belt grinder and ground down the thickness of the carbide cutter so that it would sit flush on the steel. Look at that, nice and flush. So as I was saying before, I'm using the Easy Tools CI3 replacement cutter, and that requires a 440 screw hole. This set from Irwin included the drill bit and did the job perfectly. After that, I used a little WD-40 to keep the hole nice and lubed. Once you're ready, just take it slow, and remember, every quarter turn you move forward, move a quarter turn back to clear any of the metal shavings. The bit is really skinny and could break at any time if you add too much pressure to it. It took about 10 minutes going back and forth. Just remember, take it slow and use plenty of lube. I then screwed the carbide cutter in to see how it fit. It was a little loose, so
countersink time.
I went over to my drill press and used my countersink bit to make just a slight countersink so that the cutter would screw in nice and tight. Just make sure you don't drill too deep and ruin your threads. That's some nice countersink. I headed back over to see how the cutter fit. I used a little thread lock to make sure everything was nice and tight. I tightened everything to see how it fit. Nice and flush. Now let's see how sharp it is. Yep, everything fits nice and snug and it's sharp as hell. Now it's time to make the handle. I decided to use some oak and sapelli for a contrasting handle. I first cut all the pieces on my miter saw to the correct size. I then ripped the pieces through the table saw to prepare for glue up. Once the pieces were ripped, I glued and clamped the pieces together and let them set overnight. The next day, I unclamped the wood and found that it dried a little unevenly. To fix this problem, I ran it through my planer a couple times to make the piece nice and flat. Once it was ready, I ripped the piece right down the middle. Seeing that my table saw doesn't have a dado option, I needed to adjust the saw blade to half the width of the rod and cut a groove down each piece. If you do this, just remember to make the space slightly larger than the rod to allow room for the epoxy. My blade isn't a flat bottom, so I had to chisel the groove nice and flat. Once that was done, it was time for another glue up. The next day, I unclamped the wood and headed over to the lathe. I didn't want anything too fancy, so I used my old lathe tools to make a pretty basic handle shape. Here you can see I used a caliper to make sure I cut down to the right size for the coupling. For the coupling, I'm using an extra 1-inch EMT conduit I had from a previous project. When I liked the size and the fit of the handle, I sanded it down with 220 grit sandpaper to make it nice and smooth. Because I cut a groove through the entire handle, I needed to make a plug at the end so the epoxy wouldn't leak out. I made this out of matching sapelli. Just to make sure the epoxy wouldn't leak out of the bottom, I secured it with duct tape. Now it's time to cut the coupling out of the extra EMT conduit I had. I just used a pipe cutter and cut to the exact length I needed. Now I'm just double checking the fitting, and it's onto the epoxy. For the epoxy, I'm just using 5-minute epoxy. Just remember to mix enough and to fill the entire handle. And just work fast, this stuff dries quickly. Once it's filled, I took a paper towel and cleaned off as much of the excess epoxy as I could. And now it's time to let it dry. To kill time, you can dance in the shop like my wife chose to do. Or not. Once the epoxy dried fully, I went over the entire handle again with 220 sandpaper. This was to sand down any drips of dried epoxy I missed with the paper towels. I then took a razor blade and chipped off any dried epoxy that was left on the steel rod. And for the final step, I used wipe-on polyurethane on the handle. I gave it a total of 4 coats to make the contrasting wood really pop. This was a really fun project from start to finish. For more projects, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.